Good morning and hello. I'm Bruce Weber, the Willem Quaker Dean of the Zicklin School of Business, and I'm pleased to welcome you today to this episode of Zicklin Talks Business. The topic today is private equity and a new book on its growth. Joining us is our school's namesake, Larry Zicklin, Baruch class of 1957, and Gretchen Morgenson, who wrote, "These Are the Plunderers, How Private Equity Runs and Wrecks America," with her co-author Joshua Rosen. The book recounts the 30-year history of private equity and presents evidence that private equity firms' business practices have harmed the many in favor of the few. Gretchen is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, famous for exposing conflict of interest and harmful and unethical practices on Wall Street. She's a former stockbroker who was at Dean Witter in the early 1980s. Her Pulitzer was awarded in 2002 for her trenchant and incisive financial reporting. She also co-authored Reckless Endangerment, a 2011 bestseller about the 2008 mortgage securities crisis. Since 2019, Morgenson has been a senior financial reporter in the investigations unit at NBC News. Previously, she was senior special writer at the Wall Street Journal and was a business and financial editor and columnist for nearly 20 years at the New York Times. After the conversation with Larry, there'll be a Q&A session moderated by my colleague, Associate Dean Gwendolyn Webb. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Larry.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Appreciate it. This is kind of old home week for me because Gretchen was once a guest in my class at NYU more years ago than I care to remember. Was there. Gretchen, I would be doing the students in our audience a disservice if I didn't ask you how you became a financial journalist. I'm assuming you didn't attempt it, you didn't yen to do this when you were in grade school.
No, it's a good question, Larry. And, when I came up in the ranks, there weren't a lot of female financial journalists. So I actually was an English major in college, but I always read the Wall Street Journal. I was very interested in finance and especially personal finance, but I didn't take an economics class. However, I did go to Wall Street and work as a stockbroker for 3 years. And to me, that is the equivalent of getting your MBA because you're actually in the trenches. You see how capital gets raised. You see how investors help in that process. And it really was a tremendous education for me. But it was not the job for me because I didn't like being at the mercy of the stock market. So I lived through the kind of first tech bear market of 1983, which is ancient history. Your students weren't even born then, but it was a formidable experience. And I just felt so guilty for my clients who, of course, we'd all gotten caught up in the initial stages of the tech rally, and then they lost money. So to me, that was just a deal breaker. I felt too, bad about money that gets lost in the stock market, which is, of course, a fact of life. And so then I went to writing about finance with the added knowledge that I had gained as a stockbroker. So that's kind of my hybrid of interest and experience. But yes, an English major all the way. And actually, my first job in New York was as a secretary at Vogue magazine. So there you go. How do you get there? Well, it's not always a straight line up. It's up and down and up and down.
It's rarely a straight line. I was a stockbroker also, but I discovered early on that I can handle my own losses. I couldn't handle my client losses.
I'm with you. Thank you for saying that. I mean,
couldn't handle it. So I had to change jobs, which I did. To get to the subject of our talk,
yes.
What made you write about private equity?
Well, Larry, I was just looking at the big picture of the financial world. I was seeing the creation of billionaires. I was seeing the gap between rich and poor in this country vastly widening over the years. And I was trying to figure out what had basically created those two issues. And I'm a firm believer in capitalism. So I am not an anti-capitalist. I am for the kind of capitalism that lifts up the most people. I'm for the kind of capitalism that promises prosperity for people who work hard, who may come from very little or nothing, but who have the smarts, the work ethic, and the ability to create wealth for themselves. And so that's the kind of capitalism I'm for. The form that creates more wealth for more people. I was starting to see that this country was dividing into a very small group of people who had immense wealth. And the rest of the world was left sort of with the scraps. And so I started to examine what might be creating that dynamic, and came upon, I felt, a big piece of the puzzle, which was the leveraged buyouts, now called private equity, that have really created more billionaires in the last 10 years than were ever created in hundreds of years prior to that time.
And of course,
So,
that money comes from somewhere.
yes.
When they become billions, it's not only billionaires, it's not only because their investments do so well, but sometimes money is extracted from one place and goes to another, which we're going to talk about.
Right.
When do you think private equity actually, or leveraged buyouts actually began? And I'm thinking, in my experience, that it really started with junk bonds, Michael Milken. Is that your opinion also?
That's when it really took hold, Larry. There were a couple of leveraged buyout folks involved in the early 80s before the junk bond market really started to take hold, or even the late 70s. I'm thinking of Gibson Greetings. I think that was an early leveraged buyout. That was Bill Simon, the former Treasury Secretary, I believe. So there were pockets of this. Tom Lee, I think, was a very early, promoter of this idea of taking over companies that were struggling, using debt to do so. And that leverage, when the company recovers, can be very powerful as far as what the gains can be. So you're right that it really took hold in the junk bond era, and it became a kind of almost a household word. It was the Gordon Gekko greed is good concept that really people began to, even on Main Street, began to understand. And so it sort of became, it was the RJR Nabisco deal that really put these firms on the map and in the driver's seat. So I agree, yes, that was when it really started.
And junk bonds used to be called high yield bonds, because I remember Mike Milken coming to my office once, and he explained to me the theory of high yield bonds, which we now use the term junk bonds, by saying that junk bonds default 1% of the time, but they provide a yield that's 3% higher. And on that equation, you can make a ton of money. And that was true for a while,
Right.
but ultimately it became untrue. Can you tell the story, because you write about it so well in the book, about Executive Life and what happened there?
Sure. Executive Life was a very large insurance company domiciled in California, and it was run by a former mutual fund manager from the go-go 60s named Fred Carr. And Fred Carr was an aggressive investor. He was not your typical insurance company executive. You know that insurance companies are traditionally very safe. They go for, government securities or very well-backed mortgage securities, nothing really too crazy and, high risk. But Fred Carr took that concept and sort of turned it upside down and became an extremely aggressive buyer of Mike Milken's junk bonds. They were both in Los Angeles. Leon Black was a big salesman. He was a corporate finance guy at Drexel, and he was busy selling basically these bonds to Fred Carr. Fred took an enormous position in junk bonds, believing in them and offering higher payouts to the people and his customers who bought annuities or bought other insurance contracts. And so it made Executive Life extremely popular and powerful for a time. It was highly rated by, the ratings agencies. And then it turned out that when the junk bond market cracked in the early 90s, Executive Life was on the precipice. And it actually was taken over by the California Insurance Department.
And that was, my recollection is that was less due to defaults than just the price of the bonds falling.
That's correct. Now, the interesting thing about the takeover was, in hindsight, you can see that the bonds would have recovered. But because the bond market had cracked open and so many people were talking about bond defaults, there became essentially almost a run on the insurance company. And so the California Insurance Commissioner panicked, took over the company, and then parceled it out. And that's really how Leon Black got his start at Apollo. He
became one of the founders of Apollo.
Yes, he was a co-founder of Apollo, and he and his colleagues and partners wound up buying most of the junk bonds that had been in the Executive Life portfolio for pennies on the dollar. And so you can imagine what happened when those bonds recovered. He and his partners made billions, but the insurance clients, the companies who had relied on Executive Life to be able to pay them for the rest of their lives as the company had been obligated to do, those people wound up holding the bag, getting far less than they were promised from Executive Life. And so to me, this was the kind of Rosetta Stone, if you would, for this idea of one group of financiers taking advantage of, in this case, insurance company clients making billions of dollars while they lose.
So that raises the issue of why the insurance commissioner wasn't better advised. He wasn't as sophisticated as Leon Black or Mike Milken. I understand that. But the advice was available. Why couldn't he get advice and at least throw it open to a public bid instead of selling it to Leon Black at Drexel Burnham?
Well, this turned out to be the $4 billion question, Larry. And, I dug into this very deeply to try to answer that question. And unfortunately, the commissioner, whose name is John Garamendi, who is now a representative from the state of California in the Congress, he did not want to speak to me, did not return repeated emails and calls. I did talk to people, though, who had been advising him and advising the department. And they explained to me that there just wasn't interest in understanding that these bonds might be money good at some point in time in the near future, and that you should just hang on or put them out in separate ways to bid, not put them out as a whole, which is what he insisted on doing. He insisted on there being one buyer for the portfolio. And even though advisors had told him that that was not the right thing, not the best thing to do for the highest price that you would get, that is what he did. The Apollo people got that transaction, and the rest is history. So it's a mystery still to this day, Larry.
Was he just overmatched in this situation? Here you have an insurance commissioner who's not really trained in finance. And on the other side, you have Leon Black, who's as sophisticated as they come. Was this an overmatch?
Well, don't forget, Larry, the other point was Leon Black knew all these companies very well. He had been the corporate finance guy at Drexel who raised the money for them. He knew their balance sheets back and forth. And so he knew what the value was there. So yes, completely unmatched in that regard. That's just the beginning. But then as far as negotiating, I mean, yeah, we had a very sophisticated financial person negotiating with a state insurance regulator, not a fair match.
Do you think this is true throughout private equity and the junk bond industry and the LBOs, where in most cases, the industry, the financial industry, is far more sophisticated than the folks at the other end of the transaction, and there's an overmatch there?
I think that is a big issue here in some of these transactions, particularly if they are involving public entities. Like in the book, we write about the Bayonne water, public water situation, which was a KKR deal. And, there you have a total mismatch. You've got a small city in New Jersey whose, public officials are negotiating with people from KKR, which is the quintessential leveraged buyout firm. They were the people who were the barbarians at the gate in that wonderful book about the RJR Nabisco deal. They're some of the shrewdest, smartest guys in the room. And then you've got these people, from the Bayonne City Water Department negotiating with them. That's an even worse mismatch than John Garamendi and Leon Black. But it isn't always that case. It isn't always that way. I think part of the allure, obviously, for these buyouts is that the money can be very substantial to the people who are selling, to the entities who are selling, to the shareholders who are selling their companies to private equity. The premiums that they will pay are very inviting and very alluring. So a lot of it is that idea that, I'm going to sell my company and I'm going to get rich.
You mentioned that Garamendi didn't want to talk to you. Did you get many people from the industry, from that side of the industry, willing to talk to you from the LBO side?
Yeah, not really willing to talk to me, i.e. have a conversation or an interview or a dialogue. What I generally got was very sort of truncated statements, rejecting my thesis. Of course, I wanted to talk with all of these participants, all these players in every one of the deals that the book recounts. So there are different kinds of private equity deals that we write about. One is about an aluminum smelter in Missouri. Another is
I want to talk about that, about Noranda.
Right. Another is about the Bayonne water situation. Another, is the ManorCare nursing home disaster. So I tried to discuss these particular, buyouts with these people, and I just really got very formulaic responses. So no, I did not have good engagement from these firms, unfortunately, because that always makes the story better. It always makes me more informed, and it was really unfortunate. I did hear from the lobbying organization for the private equity industry, and I asked them for, please provide me examples of deals where everyone benefited and where we are not, where you're refuting my thesis that you have this small group of people benefiting over here and a big group of people who are being hurt over here. And they did provide me with, I think, 5 examples of deals that had been remunerative. And it was interesting because most of them were, their idea of great deals were deals that made a tremendous return. And so it really kind of reinforced my notion that this is all about the money, when you really need to think about this industry as 360 degrees, involving stakeholders of all kinds: pensioners, taxpayers, employees, vendors. It's not just about, did you make money on the deal? It should be more than that. So I was very disappointed with the lack of engagement that I got from the industry.
So I read that private equity deals, I can't remember if I read it in the book or someplace else, account for more than a third of all the M&A activity in the United States. And there was $1 trillion worth of this last year. It's a big business, isn't it?
It's a big business. And the kinds of deals I'm talking about are the very large, heavily leveraged deals. I am absolutely not talking about deals where people actually do, where the private equity folks put in equity. Okay, if we're talking about investing their own equity in a transaction, that is not the kind of transaction I am describing in this book. It is really all about the big, heavily levered transactions that can benefit the private equity firm while harming other participants. And because they put so little of their own money, Larry, into these deals, if they don't perform, if they go bankrupt, for example, which big levered buyout companies do go bankrupt far more than non-levered buyouts do. So if they do go bankrupt, the private equity firm really doesn't get hurt that badly. That problem really resides with the investors who are in these deals.
Are these leveraged buyouts encouraged by government tax policies?
Yes, because of the use of debt, of course, which is a tax deductible thing. So that just to that degree, they're encouraged. But the other piece of the puzzle that you bring up here with government entities is that they haven't really been discouraged, meaning that even though, for instance, there are state laws on 30 plus states' books barring the corporate practice of medicine, you have corporations practicing medicine in all of those states, many of them private equity backed, and the state attorneys general do not pursue cases against them, even though there are laws on the books. So you have an inaction. There's no action being taken, even when there are laws on the books to prevent these kinds of takeovers.
Do you think this has anything to do with political contributions?
Well, money is always a very motivating thing, as you know, Larry. They are very big contributors, big lobbying efforts by all of these firms. But I don't really think it's money from the state attorneys generals. I believe it's just kind of inertia. Maybe they don't want to go up against these very powerful law firms that these firms have representing them. It's a mystery to me. I really do not understand it.
Perhaps they don't have the resources
to counter
these giant firms. Let me ask you a different kind of a question. An LBO takes place. The KKRs and the Apollos put up the equity, and a bunch of money is borrowed. That money is provided by institutions of one sort or another. It's not provided by individuals. Mr. and Mrs. Smith don't provide LBO money. Why do those folks, the professionals, buy these bonds if the return is not equivalent to the risk they're taking? And do I care? If institutions want to buy it, why is it my problem?
Well, this is a great question. And again, an unanswered question, because a lot of these institutions that buy into private equity funds also don't want to talk to me. I mean, I don't take it personally, but so why does a CalPERS buy into private equity operations that essentially savage workers' jobs? We all know that when a private equity firm takes over a company, employees are often fired. Okay, I think that's an academic study showed the average decline, the average cost, the average job cuts were 13%. And so why would a public pension fund whose beneficiaries are retired workers, why would they invest in a business model that basically can harm workers in this way? And that is a question that they typically answer by saying that the returns are better than other returns, stock market, bond market over time. But Larry, that is no longer the case. The returns of private equity have reverted to the mean. There is so much money chasing the same deals. You know what happens when that goes on, that we now have a situation where the returns are roughly equivalent to an S&P 500 fund with 6 basis points in costs, okay? And private equity has far higher costs, lots more opacity, very illiquid, all kinds of reasons to make them more risky, all elements that make private equity investments more risky. So why are these pension funds continuing to provide oxygen for these funds? It's really, to me, it just, I don't understand it. Maybe they're only just starting to understand that the returns are falling. As you know, private equity can mark their portfolio values very aggressively. They do not have to mark them to a daily Dow Jones Industrial Average. They can mark them where they want, and it's possible that pension funds are not seeing the actual value of their holdings yet, but it's a question, and it's an unsatisfactory answer to simply say the returns are high, so that's why we're in it.
Before I get to individual cases, I want to ask you 1 or 2 more questions. Are LBOs more leveraged today than they were 20 years ago?
Well, here's the problem with the deals today, Larry. They are issued with floating rate debt. And so what you're seeing now is an increase in bankruptcies among companies that were subject to buyouts because the debt costs float. So it's not like they're issuing them at 0% or 4%. They're rising with the interest rates that have gone up in recent months. And so this is why you're starting to see bankruptcies, considerable numbers of bankruptcies among private equity-backed companies. So I would say I don't know that they're more heavily levered, but they do seem to be more sort of positioned to be hurt by rising interest rates because of the floating rate nature of the debt.
And so much of this debt was incurred in a period when interest rates were almost nothing.
Correct.
And of course, now we've had the most rapid rate in the last 2-3 years that we've ever seen.
Right.
So it seems to me there's an impending problem out there.
Yes.
Somewhere out there, we're going to see a problem. Let me take you to some individual cases that you wrote about in your book. And I want to start with something you mentioned earlier on with Noranda in New Madrid, Missouri, which was an important company, which, as I understand it from your book, was creating 15% of primary U.S. aluminum output. Can you tell us the story of Noranda?
The story of Noranda is one of the most dispiriting stories because it really, to me, tells how the circle of pain involved in these kinds of transactions can be so large, even as the private equity firm benefits. So Apollo was the company, the private equity firm that bought Noranda. It was a very big aluminum smelter on the banks of the Mississippi River in the Boot Heel region of Missouri, not a wealthy, prospering part of the country. In fact, a pretty high poverty level. The company provided 2,500 jobs to the community, very small town. So Noranda was a big deal in the town, and they were very proud of the operation. Well, Apollo comes in, they buy it, they immediately add debt to the company. The company had been pretty debt-free prior to this. They add a lot of debt to the company, as is typical among leveraged buyouts.
I just want to point out, in your book, you mentioned that they put up $214 million of equity and took on $1.2 billion of debt.
Okay.
Go.
Excellent, excellent. So now, almost immediately, I mean, within months, Apollo had issued so much debt onto the company, Noranda had issued so much debt onto the company that they were able to take their money out. So almost immediately, it wasn't even a year before Apollo got their money out. So now everything is gravy on top of whatever the operation, is producing. So now Noranda is bumping along. It's hobbled under this massive debt load. Its interest expenses are far higher. And now we start to see that aluminum prices decline perhaps a little bit. And so Apollo starts agitating for some special treatment. They start to threaten that they're going to take the company or leave the company and, take the jobs elsewhere. They actually get the state electricity officials to lower the cost, lower the price that Apollo pays, that Noranda pays for its electricity. And that was so interesting because what happened was the rest of the ratepayers in the state of Missouri had to pay the difference. Okay, so Apollo is in a position to be very threatening to we're going to fire people. And so it was a very aggressive stance that they took. The company ultimately did go bankrupt, and it was struggling, of course, under the debt load. Apollo made 3 times its investment while it was taking money out, bleeding the company dry. When Noranda filed for bankruptcy, obviously the town's tax coffers were vastly reduced because it was no longer able to pay those. You had school teachers who had to pay their own health insurance because Noranda did not pay the taxes that were earmarked for the school district. Obviously, the people lost their jobs who worked there, at least temporarily, until the smelter was then sold. And you also had 3 pensions that were bankrupted when the company failed. And so what that meant was that the Pension Government Insurance Benefit Corp had to take them over. So taxpayers were on the hook for that. So it was an extraordinary example, or maybe not extraordinary, but a great example that is illustrative of the heads they win, tails everybody else loses of some of these transactions. And, it was so stark to me how it was an example of the gulf that is widening in this country between rich and poor. So you had people in New Madrid, Missouri, school teachers had to pay out of their own pockets for health care, workers losing their jobs, pensions being bankrupted. But Leon Black and his partners made 3 times their money.
And it's so interesting to see who the victims are, and there are victims. I want to take you to another part of your book. You write about private equity and the healthcare field. which I thought was very interesting. First of all, why would private equity choose the healthcare field to become an investor?
Well, because it's 18% of gross domestic product in this country, okay? It's a big pot of money. You also have government programs, which are perhaps a little bit easier to, what would we say, take advantage of. It's an enormous part of our economy. Everybody needs it. We have an aging, very big bulge of the population getting older who are going to be needing even more healthcare. It is a ripe target for people in the private equity industry who are looking for companies that they can buy, lever, and then flip.
So we're talking now, just so our audience understands, we're talking about hospitals, we're talking about physician practices, we're talking about nursing homes, we're talking about medical billing, we're talking about every facet of healthcare.
That's right.
We're talking about emergency rooms.
Oh, yes. So almost 40% of the nation's emergency departments are run by private equity. They're not owned, they're run by them. But that's really the same, creates the same problem because they run them in a way that is profits first, patients second.
So the decision making is made by private equity in the emergency room that might be located in a hospital.
Correct, correct. 8% of hospitals across the country are owned or operated by private equity. Some of the, I think the specialties like anesthesiology is very high level, a very high rate of private equity, radiology, dermatology, the specialties that have real money in them. We're not talking about family medicine, right? We're talking about those kinds of high profit specialties have been a huge target of private equity. And it really it's like Willie Sutton and banks. It's where the money is.
Can you talk to our audience about ManorCare, which I found especially revealing?
Well, okay, so ManorCare was a very prosperous, well-run nursing home company nationwide, many, many locations. It was a company that was taken over by Carlyle, which is a politically astute private equity company out of Washington, D.C. And ManorCare was another example of the private equity playbook and how it harmed the people who were involved, patients, workers, et cetera, in ManorCare. So Carlyle buys ManorCare. ManorCare had a very good, as I recall, patient makeup, meaning that it was very profitable. And so ManorCare wanted that profitability. Fine, that's perfectly fine.
I just want to point out, because they had a lot of private pay and
Yes.
Medicare as opposed to Medicaid.
That's right.
It doesn't pay so well.
Right, that's right. So they were a good target from that standpoint. You asked before, why would a company want to go into healthcare? Well, that's why. Well, what they did, Carlyle did almost immediately, was they sold all of the real estate under the nursing homes, which had been owned by ManorCare. ManorCare owned the real estate, owned the buildings. Carlyle comes in, they sell all the real estate under the nursing homes. And they sell it to an entity that then they generate that sale, the amount of the millions of dollars in that sale, which makes Carlyle basically free and clear of their investment. They recoup
their entire investment in the real estate
by selling the real estate under the hospitals. Okay. Again, it's obvious to anybody who's looked at an income statement. If you suddenly have to pay rent for the land that your nursing home is on, you are going to have higher costs than you had before. So all of a sudden, almost immediately, ManorCare goes cash flow negative, and because they're paying rent on these properties. The company then continues to spiral because of its costs. It has to cut other costs in order to make the rent payments. At the same time, you're having some whistleblowers who come forward to the federal government, to the Department of Justice, and talking about how the company is manipulating patients to generate Medicare payments.
Tell me what that means.
So we're talking about Medicare fraud. So what happened was they would have patients in these nursing homes that did not require physical therapy, but they would book them for physical therapy, bill the government, bill Medicare for the physical therapy appointments that the patients didn't need or want. And that was a way to generate revenues. So you had people on the inside talking about these issues, telling the government about it. The government filed suit against ManorCare. It was an enormous case. I think it was $750 million worth of Medicare fraud, which was a large number. And the government flubbed the case, and nothing happened. The case just basically went away, and the company continued. Now, it went bankrupt, just like Noranda. ManorCare went bankrupt because the business model is unsustainable. You can't start throwing a bunch of new costs on the company and, expect to not have a problem. So ManorCare was a perfect case. And let's just remember, Larry, that I think it was 2021, there was a very disturbing academic research done by NYU, UPenn, and University of Chicago, which found that private equity-owned nursing homes residents experience 10% greater mortality rates than they do at nursing homes not owned by private equity. So that is your bookend to the ManorCare story. Not only did they bankrupt the company, get all their money out, and then, leave it for dead in the ditch, people really are hurt by these practices.
So another set of victims. I just want to point out to the audience, because I have the benefit of some notes and I've read the book, that when the real estate was sold, a new cost was put on the books that you point out. That was $40 million a month, which cost never existed before that. Just imagine making up $480 million in revenues on this new cost. And you also point out something else that I was taken with. You said there were, before the takeover by Carlyle, there were 8.4% ultra-high rehabilitation days, and 2 years later, that number was 93%.
Now, what that means is there were different payments, Medicare payments, based on the kinds of physical therapy appointments that were being recommended. And so Medicare would pay more for certain kinds of appointments. And the company, like you said, it went from, what was it, 9% to 90 or something?
Yeah, 8.3 to 90 something.
Yeah. So, again, this is an answer to your question of why would private equity go into healthcare? Well, because they can take advantage of Medicare programs that really are designed to try to help people, and that the taxpayer ultimately covers.
How do you think, are there studies, let me just ask that question, that indicate how private equity ownership affects the cost of services?
Yes.
Of medical facilities?
Yes, there have been some studies that, let's see, there was an anesthesiology study in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2022 that found that patient costs rose 26% after anesthesiology practices were acquired by private equity, and other increases were 14%, for gastroenterologists, 16% for oncologists, and 9% for ophthalmologists. So it is pretty routine that these kinds of costs go up. Also, veterinarians are being bought up all over the place by private equity, and those clients are seeing costs go up. You know, it's not rocket science. They need to pay off the debt. And how else are they going to do that? Well, they're going to charge more.
When a patient enters either a nursing home or an emergency room, does that patient know that this particular nursing home or emergency room is serviced or owned by private equity?
Oh, very, very good point, Larry. I mean, part of the problem is that people do not know how pervasive private equity ownership is of companies that they deal with in their day-to-day existence. It is everywhere. It truly is. I mean, fast food, healthcare, veterinarians, real estate, apartment complexes. It's everywhere. And so these firms don't put their names on the door. You don't go into the Apollo emergency department or the KKR fast food joint. They don't advertise their ownership. And so it's very difficult for people to know. And of course, if you're going to the emergency room, that is the last thing on your mind is, gosh, am I going to have to be worried there's, is private equity running my emergency department? Keep in mind, though, that private equity was the force behind the surprise medical billing that Congress had to actually do something about. It was so outrageous. It was so beyond the pale that our dysfunctional Congress actually did something to change it. That was a KKR company called Envision that was behind the idea of taking the emergency department, carving it out, excluding it from the insurance carriers that cover the hospital. So that would create surprise medical bills that you as a patient in your most vulnerable hour when you're being taken there because of a broken bone or pneumonia or whatever, then you're going to be surprised with thousands of dollars in bills because of this manipulation of the insurance relationships.
Before I turn this over to Gwen, I just have one more question. What was the impact of private equity in the medical field during the COVID epidemic, if there was one?
Well, they got a lot of money in CARES Act funds. So they were very benefited by in COVID. Also, these firms were benefited because the Federal Reserve, for the first time, backstopped the corporate bond market. And the corporate bond market is where they raise their money. So the Fed basically, generally the Fed only backstops or buys mortgages or treasuries, they suddenly stepped in and said, we'll backstop the corporate debt market. And that was a real help to, it provided a real floor for those, bonds that were cratering during the first months of COVID. So private equity firms got a lot of money in CARES Act money who were running hospitals. They had the same problems that other hospitals did, but I think that it is that incredible focus on profits. We have a lot of for-profit healthcare in this country that is problematic, but private equity focus on profits is just a step higher than the average focus on profits for a for-profit company. So I think it just is the sort of equivalent of capitalism on steroids, as one of my sources told me.
Gwen, I'm sorry to hold you up. You're on mute, Gwen. I think you're muted, Gwen.
I'm muted. Sorry about that.
You're better now.
There are quite a few questions here as usual. The first one is from Dean Weber. Several private equity firms are publicly listed companies on U.S. exchanges. For example, Carlyle, Blackstone, KKR. could the independent directors on those boards push for improving the private equity practices that are doing harm?
They certainly could. I don't believe that that is why they were chosen, though, to sit on those boards. I think that the experience that we see too often in corporate boards is a sort of go along, get along attitude. And I think that if private equity firms directors were really to take a stand on this, I think that it would be very unwelcome.
And by the way, they're making some money because they all have some equity in these companies. It's not as if they get just a straight salary.
That's right.
So they're conflicted.
Are they truly independent in that sense?
Well, you know, all of these companies, they rely on the New York Stock Exchange definition of what is independent. And so what you and I might think of as independent is not necessarily the bar that the bar they have to clear is lower, perhaps, than what you and I might think of as independent, Gwen.
Thank you. Here's another question. Given the current regulatory landscape, what changes do you believe are necessary to better oversee private equity firms and their influences on the broader economy? And kind of associated with that, are there specific areas where you think regulation is lacking or could be beefed up?
Well, I think the Department of Justice and the FTC are starting to kind of wake up and be more aggressive about these kinds of transactions. I think the DOJ has just started a group to monitor acquisitions in healthcare. Also, the FTC has actually sued one private equity firm for its anesthesiology company ownership. The FTC maintained that company had basically monopoly power in Texas and had increased costs for clients, for patients. And so they are suing the private equity firm that owns U.S. Anesthesiology Partners. So we are starting to see more aggressive stances, but it's really from such a slow start that it, is going to take a lot more than that. As far as regulation is concerned, I mean, I think one thing that these firms really are concerned about is being labeled as systemically important financial institutions, or SIFIs. They don't want that kind of designation because it means that regulators will have more kind of scrutiny over them and more power over them. But I do believe that they have become so enormous, and the money at stake here, their pools of capital are so huge that they are significant in the economy, and they need to be overseen in that same way as SIFIs. So I think that's a possibility. I think that there have been some legislative efforts to try to prevent companies from taking the immediate dividends out, like Apollo did with Noranda and like Carlyle did with ManorCare. So make it against the law to take that money out in those kinds of ways. But that has never gotten anywhere because the lobbying efforts against those kinds of legislative moves are just enormous.
Hey, Gwen, can I interrupt for just 1 second? Gretchen, should emergency rooms really be profit-making enterprises?
Well, this is an enormous question that I really think we need to answer in this country. More and more nonprofit hospitals, formerly nonprofit community hospitals, are now for-profit entities. That number has doubled since the early 1980s. Okay, now not all nonprofit hospitals are, angels. They actually take on some of the same attributes that for-profit enterprises do, but we do have a for-profit focus in this country on healthcare that I think is very damaging and really needs to be examined very closely.
And that seems to be an enormous conflict. Delaware law, where most of these companies are not headquartered, but incorporated, says that you as a director have a responsibility to the corporation. but it doesn't say anywhere that you have a responsibility to the patient.
Right, right. Well, and it doesn't say that you have a responsibility to the worker or to the pensioner or to the taxpayers. And I get it. I get it. Their obligation is to the shareholder. But do we really want to live in a world where all those other participants, all of those other people that are involved, that really do get hurt in some of these circumstances, do we really want to have a circumstance where they don't have those obligations to those people? I think it's really worth examining.
I'm sorry, Gwen.
No problem. There are a lot of good questions here that we don't have time for, and I thank the audience for sending them. But this is now a question mostly for Larry. Suppose that we have a Baruch undergraduate student who is offered a great entry-level job at Blackstone or KKR or Carlyle.
I'm
What
sure you
advice
have
would
many.
what advice, Larry, would you give that young person?
I would give that young person the advice to take the job and make the company better.
I love that. Make it better from the inside.
Well, now that's easily said, but could you add a little more substance to how that would come about?
Well, let me tell you something. You started a company, you hope to improve your lot in life, you become more influential in the company, and you try and make it better. There are certain things that employees just shouldn't do, and certain things they can go along with. I'm not going to whistleblow on somebody that's stealing paper clips, but I'm not going to impose a value that I think is a negative value in an emergency room where somebody's life is at stake. And that's a qualitative difference, and you better know the difference, or you're not going to prosper in this business world or in this life. You've got to answer to a higher authority at some point.
Okay. Gretchen, would you agree or disagree with that?
I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. And I spent some years on Wall Street, and, the pressures there to perform, they were not in my circumstance. I had a great manager who never made me sell anything I didn't want to sell, but I know the problem, and it really can be a conundrum, and you're in the crucible. So you've just got to really do the right thing.
All right. Thank you. There are other questions. We won't have time for them. I want to thank you, Gretchen. Thank you, Larry.
You know what, Gwen? If you want to have them send me the questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay.
You can give them my work email address. I'd be happy to.
Okay, fine. I'll be happy to do that.
You may turn out to be sorry for this offer you just made, Gretchen.
I don't think so.
Constantly, so it can't get that much worse.
Very generous offer. I do want to tell our audience that next month on June 11th, we'll have a session on Elon Musk and his pay package. The title of the session is Elon Musk and the $56 billion pay package. Should there be any limits on CEO compensation? The guests will be Mr. Jeroen van Kooiwagen, Mr. Gregory Varallo, both attorneys at Bernstein, Ludowitz, Berger, Grossman. It'll be a very interesting discussion. Again, thank you, Gretchen. Thank you, Larry.
Well, thank you. It's really been a pleasure for me to join you today. And Larry, you should look at Charles Elson's affidavit in the Musk case. He just filed it, I think, yesterday. It's very interesting reading.
I know him from another life, and I will do that.
Okay.
Take care,
thank
everybody.
You all.
Gretchen, thank you again.
Anytime. Thanks, Larry.
Bye-bye.